February 27th, 1968. A bathroom in Harlem. Frankie Lymon stood in front of a mirror he'd looked into 10,000 times, and for the first time in years, he asked himself a question that terrified him. Who is the person staring back? Not Frankie Lymon, the voice that made teenage girls scream in 1956. Not the boy who sang "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" on every stage from the Apollo to the Paramount. Someone else. Someone he didn't recognize anymore. Someone who'd been famous at 13 and forgotten by 18. Someone who'd spent the last 7 years trying to remember who he was before the world told him who to be. He was 25 years old. In 6 hours, he'd be dead. But the real tragedy was that Frankie Lymon, the person, had disappeared long before his body gave out. This isn't a story about drugs. This isn't a story about fame. This is a story about what happens when a child becomes a product, and the world forgets that products are supposed to have expiration dates. Except Frankie never expired. He just stopped being useful. August 1955, Washington Heights, New York. Frankie Lymon was 12 years old, living in a cramped apartment with his parents and 5 siblings. His father sang gospel. His mother cleaned houses. Money was tight, but childhood was still possible. Frankie sang in the hallways of his building, harmonizing with his brothers, making up melodies while his mother cooked dinner. When he sang, he was just Frankie, a kid with a gift, a voice that could hit notes most grown men couldn't reach. But he was still a kid. He played stickball in the streets. He did homework at the kitchen table. He got in trouble for staying out too late. He knew exactly who he was. A boy from Harlem who happened to sing. But in the fall of 1955, Frankie met a group of teenagers who called themselves the Teenagers. Herman Santiago, Jimmy Merchant, Joe Negroni, Sherman Garnes. They were older, 15 and 16, and they needed a lead singer. Someone with range. Someone who could carry the high parts. They heard Frankie singing on a street corner and knew immediately. This kid was different. His voice didn't just hit the notes, it lived inside them. When Frankie sang, you didn't just hear music. You felt something shift in your chest. The teenagers invited him to rehearse. Frankie's mother was cautious. "These boys are older than you, baby. You sure you want to do this?" Frankie nodded. He loved singing. He loved the way the harmonies locked together. He loved being part of something. And he was still just a kid who loved music. No pressure, no expectations, just joy. Within 3 months, they'd written a song. "Why Do Fools Fall in Love?" A simple melody, a teenage question about romance and heartbreak. Herman Santiago claimed he wrote it. Jimmy Merchant said it was a group effort. Frankie just sang it. He didn't care who wrote what. He cared about the sound. The way the words felt in his mouth, the way the harmony built and released. They recorded a demo in a basement studio in Harlem. Cost $20. The recording equipment was old. The acoustics were terrible. But when Frankie's voice hit the tape, something magical happened. The engineers stopped talking. The other teenagers stopped moving. Everyone in that basement knew they were hearing something rare. The demo made its way to George Goldner, owner of G Records. Goldner was a gambler, a hustler, a man who understood that hit records were lottery tickets. He listened to "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" once and called his distributor before the song finished. "I've got something. Get ready to press." In December 1955, G Records released "Why Do Fools Fall in Love?" Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers. Lead vocal, Frankie Lymon, age 13. Nobody was ready for what happened next. The song didn't just become popular, it became a phenomenon. It climbed the R&B charts. It crossed over to pop. White kids bought it. Black kids bought it. DJs played it on repeat. Within 6 weeks, "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" was number 6 on the Billboard Hot 100. Frankie Lymon's voice was suddenly everywhere. On the radio, in jukeboxes, in living rooms across America. A 13-year-old boy from Harlem had created a sound that the entire country couldn't stop listening to. And that's when Frankie Lymon, the person, started to disappear. January 1956. The Apollo Theater, Harlem. Frankie stood backstage, his hands shaking. He could hear the crowd through the walls, screaming, chanting his name, Frankie, Frankie, Frankie. He'd performed at the Apollo before, but as an amateur, a kid in a talent show. This was different. This was the main stage, headlining, his name on the marquee. The teenagers stood beside him, nervous but excited. Herman kept adjusting his tie. Jimmy kept clearing his throat. Joe kept looking at Frankie like he was seeing him for the first time. "You ready, little man?" Frankie nodded, but he wasn't sure. He was 13. He should have been in 8th grade, worrying about math homework and basketball tryouts. Instead, he was about to walk onto the most famous stage in Black America and perform for a sold-out crowd that expected perfection. The stage manager called their name. The curtain opened. The lights hit Frankie's face, and for a moment he couldn't see anything. Just white heat and the roar of 2,000 people who'd paid money to see him. Not the teenagers. Him, the boy with the voice. He gripped the microphone. The music started, and when Frankie opened his mouth and sang the first line of "Why Do Fools Fall in Love?", the Apollo Theater lost its mind. Girls screamed, women shouted, men stood up and applauded before he even finished the first verse. Frankie sang the way he always sang, with his whole heart, his whole body, every note clear and true. But something felt different. For the first time, Frankie wasn't singing for joy. He was singing because people were watching, because they expected him to sound exactly like the record, because if he didn't, they'd be disappointed. The performance was flawless. The crowd gave him a standing ovation. Backstage, everyone told him he was brilliant, a natural, a star. But walking back to the dressing room, Frankie felt something strange, a distance, like he was watching himself from somewhere else. Like the boy on stage wasn't really him. It was someone named Frankie Lymon, and Frankie Lymon had a job to do. The hits kept coming. "I Want You to Be My Girl," "I Promise to Remember," "The ABCs of Love." Each song climbed the charts. Each performance sold out. By the summer of 1956, Frankie Lymon and the Teenagers were one of the biggest acts in America. They played the Paramount Theater in Brooklyn, the Howard in Washington, D.C., the Regal in Chicago. They appeared on national television. They recorded an album. They met celebrities. Everyone wanted to meet the kid with the golden voice. But nobody asked Frankie how he was doing. Nobody asked if he was tired. Nobody asked if he missed being a regular kid, because Frankie Lymon wasn't a kid anymore. He was a brand, a product, a voice that made money. And products don't get to be tired. Frankie's schedule became brutal. Recording sessions during the day, performances at night, photo shoots on weekends, interviews whenever the label demanded. He was 13 years old, and his life was no longer his own. His mother tried to protect him. "Baby, you need rest. You need to go to school." But the record label had other plans. School could wait. Childhood could wait. Right now, America wanted Frankie Lymon. And when America wants something, you give it to them. Or you disappear. Frankie learned quickly that saying no wasn't an option. When he was too tired to rehearse, the label brought in a doctor who gave him pills to keep him awake. When he was too nervous to perform, they gave him something to calm him down. When he complained about the schedule, they reminded him how lucky he was. Do you know how many kids would kill for this opportunity? You're a star, Frankie. Act like it. So Frankie acted like it. He smiled for the cameras. He signed autographs. He performed the same songs over and over, even when he was sick, even when his voice hurt, even when he just wanted to go home and be a kid. And slowly, without realizing it, Frankie started to split into two people. There was the boy who still lived inside him, who wanted to play stickball and eat his mother's cooking and sleep past noon on Saturdays. And there was Frankie Lymon, the performer, the star, the voice that belonged to everyone except himself. The problem was, the world only wanted one of those people, and it wasn't the boy. By late 1956, Frankie had performed Why Do Fools Fall in Love more than 300 times. The same song, the same choreography, the same smile. Every night, a different audience. Every night, the same expectations. Sing it exactly like the record, Frankie. Don't change anything. Don't improvise. Don't grow. Just be the 13-year-old who sang that song in December 1955. Forever. Frankie tried. He really did. But something inside him was starting to crack. He'd look at himself in dressing room mirrors and not recognize the person staring back. The boy in the mirror had dark circles under his eyes. His smile looked rehearsed. His movements looked mechanical. This wasn't joy anymore. This was survival. One night, after a show in Philadelphia, Frankie sat alone in his hotel room and cried. Not because he was sad, because he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt like himself. The real him. Not Frankie Lymon, the star, just Frankie, the kid from Harlem. That boy felt like a memory, like someone who'd existed in another lifetime. And the terrifying part was, Frankie couldn't remember when the switch happened. When had he stopped being a person and started being a performance, but nobody noticed? How could they? Frankie Lymon was a star. Stars don't cry. Stars don't break. Stars just shine until they burn out. Then, in early 1957, something happened that changed everything. Frankie Lymon's voice started to change. He was 14, almost 15. Puberty was inevitable. But for Frankie, puberty wasn't just a biological process, it was a career death sentence. The voice that had made him famous, that high, clear, almost angelic tenor, started to deepen. The notes that used to come easily now required effort. The range that had defined his sound began to shrink. At first, it was subtle, a crack here and there during rehearsals, a note that didn't quite hit. The other teenagers noticed but didn't say anything. The producers noticed and started to panic. George Goldner pulled Frankie aside after a recording session. "Kid, we need to talk about your voice. It's changing." "I know," Frankie said quietly. He'd been terrified of this conversation. "Can you control it? Can you keep it high?" Frankie stared at him. "I don't think that's how it works." Goldner's face hardened. "Well, you better figure it out, because that voice is what makes you valuable. Without it, you're just another kid from Harlem." The words hit Frankie like a punch. Without it, you're just another kid. His entire identity, his entire worth, had been reduced to a biological function he couldn't control. He tried. He trained with vocal coaches who taught him techniques to preserve his range. He strained and pushed and fought his own body, trying to sound like the 13-year-old boy the world wanted him to be. But nature didn't care what the world wanted. By mid-1957, Frankie's voice had dropped significantly. The high notes that defined Why Do Fools Fall in Love were gone. The sound that had made him a star no longer existed. And the moment his voice changed, the industry's interest in Frankie Lymon evaporated. Record sales dropped. Bookings slowed. The teenagers released new material, but it didn't chart. Radio stations stopped playing their songs. The same DJs who'd championed Frankie a year earlier now said his sound was outdated. Teen audiences moved on to the next big thing. Frankie Lymon, at 15 years old, was has-been. The career that had consumed his childhood was over, and he hadn't even finished high school. The teenagers broke up in 1958. Herman, Jimmy, Joe, and Sherman went their separate ways, trying to find other groups, other opportunities. Frankie tried to go solo. He signed with new labels, recorded new songs, tried to reinvent himself as an adult performer. But nobody wanted adult Frankie Lymon. They wanted the kid with the high voice, the boy who sang about teenage love with innocence and wonder. Adult Frankie was just another singer. Unremarkable, forgettable, replaceable. Every audition became a reminder of who he used to be. You're Frankie Lymon? The kid who sang Why Do Fools? What happened to your voice? Every failed single was another nail in the coffin of his relevance. Every empty concert hall was proof that the world had moved on. And Frankie, stuck between childhood and adulthood, between who he was and who he'd been forced to become, started to lose his grip on reality. Because here's what nobody tells you about child stardom. When your entire identity is built on something external, on applause and recognition and validation from strangers, what happens when that validation disappears? Who are you when the crowds stop screaming? When the phones stop ringing? When people look at you and say, "Didn't you used to be somebody?" Frankie Lymon didn't know, because he'd never been allowed to figure out who Frankie was without the fame. He'd gone from child to product without ever becoming a person. And now, at 17 years old, he was lost. Completely, terrifyingly lost. He started using heroin in 1959. Not because he wanted to, because he needed to stop feeling the emptiness. The drugs made everything quiet, made the voices in his head stop asking, "Who are you now?" Made the shame of being a has-been at 18 feel distant and manageable. When Frankie was high, he could pretend he was still valuable, still important, still somebody. But when the high faded, the truth came crashing back. He was nobody, a footnote, a one-hit wonder, the boy who'd been famous and thrown away. His mother begged him to stop. "Baby, this isn't you. Come home. Let's figure this out." But Frankie couldn't go home, because home was where the boy he used to be still existed in his mother's memory. And Frankie couldn't face that boy, couldn't face the innocent kid who'd loved singing just because it felt good. That kid was dead, killed by contracts and schedules and adults who'd turned him into a cash machine and discarded him when he stopped printing money. Between 1960 and 1967, Frankie Lymon tried to get clean multiple times. He'd check into rehab, stay sober for weeks, sometimes months. He'd try to restart his career. He'd book small club gigs, oldies shows where he'd sing "Why Do Fools Fall in Love" for audiences who remembered when he was famous. And every time he sang that song, it felt like a funeral, a reminder of who he'd been, who he'd never be again. The applause felt like pity, like people mourning a dead child while his ghost performed on stage. He got married 3 times, each relationship a desperate attempt to feel connected to something real, to be seen as a person, not a former star. But each marriage collapsed under the weight of his addiction, his depression, his inability to explain the hole inside him that fame had created and heroin temporarily filled. His wives tried to help, tried to love him back to stability, but Frankie was too far gone. The boy who'd known who he was had disappeared in 1956, and the man who could have replaced him never got the chance to develop. By 1968, Frankie Lymon was 25 years old and completely invisible. The music industry had moved on. Rock and roll had evolved. Motown dominated the charts. The British invasion had changed everything. Nobody cared about doo-wop anymore. Nobody remembered the 13-year-old who'd started it all. Frankie lived with his grandmother in Harlem, the same neighborhood where he'd sung on street corners as a kid. But he wasn't that kid anymore. He was a hollow shell, a man who'd been famous and forgotten, a voice that belonged to the past. February 27, 1968. Frankie woke up in his grandmother's apartment. He hadn't slept well. He never did. He looked at himself in the bathroom mirror, and the question came again. Who is this person? Not the boy from 1955 who sang for joy. Not the star from 1956 who performed for thousands. Not even the has-been from 1960 trying to recapture something already gone. Just a stranger. A body that had survived fame but lost the person inside. Later that day, Frankie found his grandmother's supply of heroin. He'd been trying to stay clean, trying to get it together, trying to find some reason to keep going. But on that day, in that moment, he couldn't remember why. The drugs offered the only peace he'd known in years. The only time the question, "Who are you?" stopped echoing in his head. He prepared the dose. He injected it. And he lay down in the bathroom, waiting for the quiet to come. His grandmother found him hours later, 25 years old, dead in the bathroom of the apartment where he'd grown up. The boy who'd made millions of people feel something with his voice had died alone, trying to feel nothing. The newspapers ran small obituaries. Former child star Frankie Lymon found dead of apparent overdose. A few sentences, a footnote. The world that had consumed him barely noticed when he was gone. But the cruelest irony was this. Why Do Fools Fall in Love kept playing, on oldies stations, in movies, in commercials. The voice of 13-year-old Frankie Lymon, frozen in time, continued to make money for record labels and publishers and lawyers. The song outlived the person. The product survived long after the child who created it had been destroyed. In the years after his death, 3 women came forward, each claiming to be Frankie Lymon's widow, each fighting for the rights to his royalties. The legal battle lasted decades. Lawyers argued over who owned Frankie Lymon's legacy, who deserved the money his voice still generated. But nobody asked the real question. Who had owned Frankie when he was alive? Who had protected the child behind the voice? Who had made sure that Frankie Lymon, the person, was allowed to exist alongside Frankie Lymon, the product? The answer was nobody. Because in 1956, America didn't care about the children it turned into stars. It cared about the entertainment, the profit, the next big thing. And when that thing stopped being profitable, it was discarded. Frankie Lymon wasn't the first child star to be consumed and destroyed. He wouldn't be the last. But his story carries a question that echoes through every generation. What do we owe the children we turn into products? What happens when we take a kid with a gift and turn that gift into a prison? Decades later, musicians who studied the history of rock and roll would point to Frankie Lymon as a pioneer, a groundbreaker, one of the first teenagers to prove that youth culture could dominate popular music. They'd analyze his vocal technique, his influence on Motown, his role in integrating the pop charts. And they'd be right. Frankie Lymon changed music history. But the cost of that change was his life, his identity, his chance to become a person instead of just a voice. Today, Why Do Fools Fall in Love is considered a classic, a defining song of the 1950s. When people hear it, they hear innocence, joy, the sound of teenage love and possibility. They don't hear the 13-year-old boy who was turned into a product, who spent his teenage years trying to be a brand instead of a person, who died at 25 because he never figured out who he was when the applause stopped. The song is immortal. The person who sang it was disposable. And maybe that's the real tragedy of Frankie Lymon. Not the drugs, not the death, but the fact that the world loved his voice so much that it forgot there was a human being attached to it. A boy who wanted to sing, who loved music, who should have been allowed to grow up, make mistakes, change, evolve, and discover who he was beyond the sound he could make. Instead, Frankie Lymon became a warning, a cautionary tale about what happens when we consume children in the name of entertainment. When we demand they stay frozen in time, performing the version of themselves we fell in love with, never allowed to grow, never allowed to be human. Some voices never grow old, even when the people behind them are forced to disappear. Frankie Lymon's voice will play forever, young and hopeful and untouched by time. But the boy who owned that voice never got that luxury. He grew up in public, he broke in private, and he died trying to remember who he was before the world told him who to be. If you've ever wondered what fame costs, listen to Why Do Fools Fall in Love, and remember this. The voice you're hearing belonged to a child who never got to become an adult, who never got to be just Frankie, who died asking the same question he'd been asking since 1956. Who am I when nobody's watching? The world never let him find out.